limitations inherent in that, but you certainly can.
You talked to Ms. Heard for, what, approximately 30 hours, right?
Correct.
How long have you spent with Mr. Depp?
I did not spend any time with Mr. Depp. It was my understanding that he did not sit for a psychological evaluation.
Right. In fact, you never met Mr. Depp, have you?
I have not.
But you purport to be able to assess the relationship between Mr. Depp and Ms. Heard?
But I also read Mr. Depp's transcripts of his testimony. I watched his deposition testimony. I reviewed his medical records. I reviewed his text messages. So it's not necessarily totally blind. I did have information, although I'm not making a conclusion about Mr. Depp himself.
Is the standard now not necessarily totally blind? That's how you assess the relationship? If it's not necessarily totally blind, I can assess it?
No, we assess as clinical psychologists relationships all the time. That's what we're trained to do. Certainly someone who's been trained in intimate partner violence to understand and look for the dynamics that happen in that relationship. And then when we have external data that supports what the individual is telling us, way before this legal case even came on the scene, that becomes very strong data to support that conclusion. Let's
talk about some of that data.
Sure.
All right. You chose to conduct some collateral interviews.
Correct.
Right? And you interviewed Dr. Bonnie Jacobs.
Correct.
And you looked at her notes.
Correct.
And you know that Ms. Jacobs, Dr. Jacobs, doesn't know anything about the version of what happened in Australia until Ms. Heard had already been sued. Correct?
I believe she was not in treatment with Dr. Jacobs at the time the Australia incident occurred, so that would be correct. She did reach out to Dr. Connell Cohen about Australia, who she was treating with at that time contemporaneously.
All right, I'll ask you about Dr. Cohen. We'll get there. Right. So, you know that Ms. Heard stopped seeing Dr. Jacobs in August 2014.
That's correct.
And she didn't go back until after she got sued, right?
I believe that's the date. I'd have to look to make sure, but I believe that you're correct.
Yeah. And you said you reviewed you interviewed Dr. Connell Cohen.
That's correct.
And you also reviewed his deposition testimony.
That's correct.
And you know that he testified that when he was treating a patient, he assumes the patient is telling the truth, correct?
I believe he said something to that effect in his deposition.
And
if he has no reason to believe otherwise, if there's no other data to believe otherwise, that your patient's not being totally honest with you, then you believe what they're saying.
Right. No other data to believe otherwise, but the sole thing that's happening is Ms. Heard is talking to Mr. Cohen, or Dr. Cohen.
I wouldn't say she's talking to him. She's going to him for therapy, and he's using his clinical psychological expertise to understand the connection between her symptoms and what she's reporting, what's going on in her life.
All right. But you understand that he testified that he assumes the patient is telling the truth.
Again, I understand that statement in his testimony. I have a lot more rich information of having spoken to him for 2 hours and reviewing his clinical notes.
Testified he was making a leap of faith with respect to that, right? With respect to the truthfulness.
Again, that was not my understanding of speaking with him and reviewing his notes. I'm aware he testified something to that effect.
All right. And you testified yesterday that Dr. Cohen never diagnosed Ms. Heard with any personality disorders. You remember that?
Yes.
In fact, Dr. Cohen's deposition testimony reflects the fact that he doesn't make diagnoses, correct?
Correct, and I asked him specifically, did he have any indications that even if he doesn't, as his practice, use them, does she meet criteria for a personality disorder? And he told me she did not.
All right, so you asked him specifically with respect to a topic that you haven't disclosed in your expert report, and then he made a conclusion that's reflected in no document.
It's reflected in my notes. It's reflected in his notes about what he's treating. He's treating the symptoms. He's not focusing on the diagnosis, but he is treating the symptoms.
You talked about Dr. Cohen's concern for Ms. Heard's safety.
Correct.
he wasn't talking about her physical safety, was he?
Yes, he was.
No, he was talking about her emotional safety. Wasn't that what he was talking about?
He was concerned for both.
Okay. Did Dr. Cohen testify that he never had the feeling that Johnny intended to hurt Ms. Heard?
I believe he said that. I mean, he talked about Mr. Depp being very poorly controlled, and that's what made him, Dr. Cohen, concerned, because in those moments when he was not controlled, that he could accidentally seriously hurt Ms. Heard.
Let's do this again. Ms. Heard told Dr. Cohen that Mr. Depp was poorly controlled, correct?
That's not correct.
Okay. He determined that from the treatment he was providing Ms. Heard.
And he also had a couple session with Mr. Depp, and he also had correspondence with Dr. Kipper. So he had other information as to Mr. Depp's functioning.
All right, you talked about Dr. Banks.
Correct.
Dr. Banks was doing relationship consulting, right? Consultation on relationship.
Correct.
And Dr. Banks only met with them once.
Correct.
All right. And you did an interview, I think, with Ms. Heard's mother, Paige.
That's correct.
All right. You'd agree with me that a person's family member is not the most objective source of information?
Sometimes you have to certainly control for that the person may be wanting to be protective of their daughter, of course. And
you interviewed Ms. Paige Heard after Mr. Depp had already sued Amber Heard.
Right. The entirety of my work in this case happened, obviously, after the lawsuit.
Did you review, in that context, any of Paige Heard's text messages with Mr. Depp?
I'm not sure if I saw them with Mr. Depp. I do believe I saw some with Ms. Heard. I mean, Miss Paige Heard, Amber Heard's mother, did talk to me about her relationship with Mr. Depp.
And she told you that she loved Johnny even after Amber alleged abuse, correct?
She did.
All right. Now, you testified that you approach a forensic evaluation with, I think you said it again today, a healthy degree of skepticism.
Correct.
All right. This skepticism didn't cause you to conduct interviews with, for instance, Laurel Anderson.
Right, I did not speak to Dr. Laurel Anderson.
And you chose not to speak to Dr. Laurel Anderson because you disagreed with Dr. Laurel Anderson?
That's not correct.
All right. What did Dr. Laurel Anderson do on behalf of Ms. Heard and Mr. Depp?
She was a couples therapist that they sought. They had 4 couples sessions. As I stated yesterday, one of them in which Mr. Depp stormed out of. She did have a long, I guess, evaluation or interview with Mr. Depp individually and with Ms. Heard individually. And then she saw them intermittently after the May 21st, 2016 incident, and when they were filing for divorce.
So you didn't interview Laurel Anderson, but you know what she did? How'd you figure that out?
Because we had her redacted notes and her deposition.
All right. And you understood from her deposition that Dr. Anderson didn't believe Ms. Heard to be a victim of spousal abuse?
I believe those were her words, yes.
And you also understood from her deposition that Mr. Depp had not had a very long history of being violent with any of his wife or women.
That she said that as well.
Yeah.
But that's something about Ms. Heard significantly triggered him. She talked about that as well.
And Dr. Anderson thought that Mr. Depp had been, her words, well controlled, I think for almost 20 or 30 years, correct?
Up until this point, I believe she said.
Right. I know that you testified that you reviewed medical records.
Yes.
All right. So, you know Ms. Heard had a personal nurse.
Correct.
Erin Filati.
Correct.
You didn't interview Ms. Filati either.
I did not.
You know she spent time with Ms. Heard on a regular basis during her relationship with Mr. Depp.
Correct. I had her clinical notes that I reviewed.
Right. And you reviewed her deposition testimony.
Correct.
Some of which the jury's heard, right?
I believe so.
Yeah. And you reviewed the nursing notes.
Yes.
So you know that Ms. Heard admitted to a history of eating disorders to Ms. Filati, correct?
I know that's in the notes. That's nowhere else in any other record, so I'm not sure where that came from.
But you relied on everybody else's notes.
And there are some things that I disagreed with, like I disagree with Dr. Laurel Anderson about it being mutual abuse.
Right. So the stuff you disagree with, you disregard, and the rest you keep, correct?
That's not correct.
But that's what you did.
That's not correct.
All right. You know that Ms. Filati saw Ms. Heard immediately after she returned from Australia.
I'd have to look at the notes again to be sure, but I know she did see her when she came back from Australia. That's correct.
Did Ms. Filati document any injuries to Ms. Heard in her notes?
I did not see that in the record.
Okay, so you looked at her notes, and there's no injury to Ms. Heard documented in her nurse's notes following her return from Australia?
Correct.
Okay. You talked about this concept, which you then defined, lethality. And you testified there are certain factors of their present relationship where a woman ends up murdered by her partner.
Correct.
And that's one of the ways you look as to whether a woman is in a very dangerous situation.
Correct.
Can we pull up PX 92?
It's an evidence.
Published to the jury.
Yeah, it will be published.
Do you know what this is?
I believe this is the knife that Ms. Heard gave to Mr. Depp as a gift.
All right. And you speak Spanish?
Un poquito?
Do you know what it says?
Yes, it says hasta la muerta, until death.
So a woman you suggest has characteristics of being afraid for her life, gives her intimate partner a large knife, which she has inscribed until death. That's your testimony?
Well, there's context.
Okay. We can do that later. So we talked about, you talked a little bit about Mr. Depp purporting to demonstrate jealousy with Ms. Heard. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And you specifically talked about